as these new workloads are emerging, new use cases are emerging, do you also see that, hey, this is what Cloud Foundry was, kind of designed to do? So where you suddenly see that there might be a lot of interest again in Cloud Foundry because it is solving some of those problems in a way that's meant to be solved.
I truly believe that if you're writing, a lot of applications, they're cloud native, they're 12-factor compliant, you like the concept of a build pack, you want to have multi-tenancy, and you're running an organization with hundreds or thousands of developers, why would you go start building your own platform with Kubernetes? Look at the Kubernetes CNCF ecosystem. It's a pleasure. Like, I love it. But it's so many little building blocks. If you want to build your platform, don't underestimate the complexity of it. So if Cloud Foundry does the trick, take Cloud Foundry. This is not a popularity contest. This is about finding the right tool for the right job. I believe that in 2024, CIO and CTOs should consider Cloud Foundry as a technology. We are over the days where we thought that Cloud Foundry will go away. It won't go away. It will be here for years to come.
Hi, this is your host Sapnil Bhartiya and welcome to TFR Let's Talk. Today we have with us two regular guests, Julian Fischer, CEO and founder of Anynines, and Ram Iyengar, Chief Evangelist at the Cloud Foundry Foundation. Ram, Julian, it's great to have you both on the show.
Great to be here. Thank you.
Nice to be here, Swapnil.
It's my pleasure to host you folks here. And today there is so much to talk about. The first thing that I would love to discuss with folks is that we are celebrating 10 years of Kubernetes. Of course, I would love to talk about how it has evolved, how it has grown, but I want to talk about something very, very personal, which depends on how you look at it, is that when Kubernetes was announced, where were you folks? What were you folks doing? And what was your reaction when you heard of a thing called Kubernetes?
Well, I can't actually remember where I exactly was, but I thought, there was a race going on container orchestration at the time. Some people refer to it as the container orchestration wars. And I had mixed feelings about this whole terminology because all these container orchestrators, they do have different flavors and different focus, and they're not as comparable as you may think in the first place. So overall, I'd say when I heard about Kubernetes and what it was doing and how it was doing, I was curious, and that feeling, at least the curiosity stuck.
Yeah, I have a rather polarizing story about when I first heard about Kubernetes. I remember very clearly being at a Mesos meetup, thinking that Mesos is going to be the container orchestrator of the future. That's what we are going to graduate into, using containers and putting all our containers and things like that. Boy, was I wrong. It's really heartening to see the community come together, gather around a technology, and spawn so much in terms of tools and techniques and just the community. So I remember someone fondly tweeting about, came here for the technology, stayed for the community, which is so true in my case as well.
Excellent. Thank you. Now let's talk about how you have seen the evolution of Kubernetes from the lens of Cloud Foundry.
So I'd say when I saw Kubernetes for the first times, I didn't really care so much. It was when Kubernetes picked up momentum and started to cannibalize attention that Cloud Foundry had before. That was when I got into a bit of a sorrow that Kubernetes might entirely cannibalize Cloud Foundry as a movement. And I think it's an interesting story here, because over the years, I remember there were conferences where people thought that Cloud Foundry would go away entirely. Like, there was the mood and the overall feeling was very, very bad. I thought that's going to end pretty soon, and I was absolutely surprised to see that over the years this just did not happen. And one thing is very clear to me now, is that Kubernetes never conquered the business case that Cloud Foundry made. which is, running thousands or 10,000s of applications with high operational efficiency in a platform as a service like manner, where, you as an organization, you can just throw tenants at it. You have a marketplace with proper abstractions. And so when sometimes, especially when it was early days where with bad news about Cloud Foundry and a lot of hype around Kubernetes were happening, customers asked me, well, what to do with Cloud Foundry environments? And they went nowhere. That has a reason.
Yeah, I'd echo most of those sentiments that Julian had mentioned. From a community perspective, it was sort of a little bit disheartening, I must say, to see the community around Cloud Foundry shrink a little and watch the community around Kubernetes grow. But what we've observed over the years is as people have started to experiment and pilot with Kubernetes, a lot of people have come to us and say, hey, we wish there was something Cloud Foundry like running on Kubernetes. So we're sort of, very proud of having that moniker of solving a lot of these platform and PaaS problems, like Julian mentioned, way before this community has hit them. But we're also, somewhat working towards a way where both the technologies can sort of co-op together, where Kubernetes provides a lot of the underlying foundational aspects, and Cloud Foundry can bring in that polished developer experience that it's known for, and can work together and converge in a manner that's beneficial to the technical community at large.
Can you also talk a bit about what is Cloud Foundry when we now look at Kubernetes lenses, the folks who are invested in Kubernetes, because you're also talking about Cloud Foundry developer experience. In Kubernetes world, we don't talk much about the developer experience, but you have CVF push. And I mean, there are a lot of, technology that we used to talk a lot about. So talk about Cloud Foundry in the Kubernetes world.
So if I had to define Cloud Foundry to somebody who came from the Kubernetes ecosystem, let's say, or for somebody new, I would define it as an abstraction over your cloud infrastructure that has evolved from being exclusive to managing VMs as compute to being operational over other abstractions like Kubernetes today. So the idea of Cloud Foundry is to help developers consume your infrastructure better, whether it's traditional VMs, whether it's Kubernetes today, whether you have a flavor of OpenShift. You can really bring all of these foundational infrastructure based technologies and have an abstraction over them that can help your developers, like I said, consume these ways of cloud infrastructure better. And we've seen a lot of people take advantage of this, anynines being a good example, where they advertise themselves as being the best PaaS over VM infrastructure from Google, from Amazon, from VMware, now Broadcom, whether you're using OpenShift or even OpenStack. So Cloud Foundry is something that will help be that common denominator across your multi-cloud spread.
Today it's safe to say that most organizations who run Cloud Foundry also have Kubernetes. However, I absolutely misjudged the dynamics on how Kubernetes adoption takes place. So there are organizations who use Kubernetes where Cloud Foundry doesn't fit. So for example, if you have applications that are for some reason already packaged in Kubernetes, or they have requirements that make them not 12-factor compliant, for example, they don't fit the Cloud Foundry operational model, and they better go to Kubernetes. I thought that Kubernetes would cannibalize the existence of Cloud Foundry entirely. Because, whatever you run on Cloud Foundry, you can basically run on Kubernetes too. But that's not what's happening. So I would say, a lot of times when Cloud Foundry and Kubernetes coexist, especially when larger organizations sitting on, or having large teams of developers introduce Cloud Foundry, they hesitate, and that's the least to say, to move away from Cloud Foundry towards Kubernetes, because when they do, they get a sense of the operational overhead they are adding by using Kubernetes, because the replacement, and that's a topic we had over the years many times, and it still stands to the day, that if you take a large Cloud Foundry environment, let's say with 5,000 apps, you usually have like hundreds of tenants that share a little trust relationship to each other. If you map that to a Kubernetes ecosystem-based platform, then you'd be looking at a lot of Kubernetes clusters. So then the question is, who takes care of those Kubernetes clusters? And even if you have the competencies to do that, then you'd still have the additional overhead. And overhead spreads across those teams. So let's say you have 5,000 apps and you have 50 teams. The operational overhead of running 50 Kubernetes clusters and dealing with databases and having no data service abstractions like you'd have in a Cloud Foundry with Marketplace, no tenant management, that creates a lot of problems. The Kubernetes ecosystem is keen to solve them, but even if all the building blocks are out there, the customers now have to reassemble and build their own platforms. With a lot of people think it's simple, but it's not, and they fail doing so. So I would predict that over the next years, we'll see a lot of integration work needs to be done in order to mitigate the furious chaos that happens when you let people use Kubernetes without a proper policy in place.
Now, if you look at the early days of Kubernetes, I'll go back to the past. It was mostly about handling stateless workloads. Now, of course, we are all running a stateful workload. Now, when we look at Cloud Foundry versus Kubernetes, do you see them now complementing each other, or you still see them as kind of competing technologies? One solves one problem, other solves other problem, or they're overlapping, so that's where we'll struggle, who will be the winner? How do you see these two technologies?
I'd say that in contrast to my earlier assumptions that Cloud Foundry and Kubernetes are core competitors, I would say they are more in symbiosis these days. I see room for both technologies to coexist. They have their own merits, their pros and cons. So when it comes to stateful workloads, one of the big advantages that come with Cloud Foundry is that you have a marketplace and you have the Open Service Broker API that gives you proper abstractions for service instances, service bindings, and service plans. So you basically are able to integrate any backing service, any cloud database or whatsoever by implementing a REST interface. It's relatively simple and straightforward. And that allows you to also govern which data services can be accessed by developers. And you have a control how and what kind of automation is exposed there. So there's a means of targeting, let's say, thousands of developers with a curated set of data services. So, that's already a lot. And if you think about the Kubernetes ecosystem, you don't have a ecosystem-wide abstraction for data service management at this point. So, if you think about larger environments, like a lot of developers, they think about a few Kubernetes clusters. Well, a lot of problems we are talking about, or I'm talking about, they don't occur if you only have 5 Kubernetes clusters. But think about 500. So if you, for example, look at stateful workloads in Kubernetes, you have a lot of operators these days that allow you, let's say, to create a Postgres database. I think there's around a dozen of them currently floating around. So it's relatively easy. If you have an app and want to have a Postgres, you download an operator and there you got your Postgres. That's not the issue. And that's not the issue large organizations are facing that use Cloud Foundry. Because we're looking at organizations that usually have hundreds, if not thousands or 10,000s of developers. So, as I said, you'd be dealing with a lot of Kubernetes clusters. Now, if you're looking at stateful workloads and you think about, well, where do databases usually reside and where should they reside, you will find out that most organizations of a certain size come to the conclusion very early that they should not co-locate their databases with their applications in the same Kubernetes cluster. Because managing a Kubernetes cluster, managing your application and your databases in the same thing is quite dangerous to do so. And it requires a profound cross-functional skill set in a team to do that. And I mean, if you think about having, let's say, 500 teams, and each team needs that profile set, you'd be asking for a lot of unicorns to hire in your company, which is a tremendous problem. And Cloud Foundry mitigates that by saying, well, look, there's a standard interface, and you can create service, let's say a Postgres, and some automation will do the trick for you. Now, if you're at that point in Kubernetes, the first thing you have to do in order to get there is to introduce a set of abstractions that defines a service instance, a service plan, a service binding, and last but not least, backup and restore functionality. And the second question is then, all right, you can take an operator to make that happen, but then you're again running the database in the cluster. So you could then say, well, I'm running the database in another cluster, but then you need a remote control for that other cluster. And, you know, if you're, let's say, on Amazon and you want an Amazon RDS database, or you want a virtual machine-based database because it's more solid and has a better noisy neighborhood protection, you know, do you really want to lock yourself into running a database on Kubernetes in the same cluster? So what we believe is what is going to happen in Kubernetes, well, and spoiler alert, we're open sourcing a technology to do exactly that, which is called Clutch with the leading K, is you have abstractions for the most common data services that will allow you to create a service instance in a Kubernetes cluster, which will then talk to a central management cluster, also running in Kubernetes, where service instance information and service binding information and service plan information is stored, also backup and restore. And you can, from there, delegate the actual creation to pluggable automation backends, which could be, for example, the anynines database automation, which creates virtual machines, or pod-based operators, or Amazon or Azure native data services for that matter. So in my understanding of stateful workloads in Kubernetes, if you're looking at large environments, is that you can use Kubernetes and operators to run databases in Kubernetes, but you don't have to. And either way, you have to somehow let your application developers have the on-demand self-service experience you would have with the Cloud Foundry, but still provide a central management tool that give you that cloud controller-like feature where you have the ability to enumerate all the service instances, regardless on which application cluster they are used, and regardless which automation backends where the service instances are actually provisioned. So in that regard, I find that without such an integration technology, the Kubernetes ecosystem lacks of the tooling to deal with a lot of data services across a lot of Kubernetes clusters in a meaningful way that governance requirements of large enterprises would be fulfilled. In that regard, Cloud Foundry is way ahead.
Yeah, I think there are some broad themes that I feel are where Cloud Foundry sort of helps bridge certain gaps that are in the Kubernetes world. And Kubernetes sort of paves the way for something like Cloud Foundry to actually exist over and above their abstraction. So in that way of thinking, the two technologies are very complementary, because a lot of times when I even started to work with Cloud Foundry, a lot of people would come and say, Cloud Foundry versus Kubernetes, what's your take, and things like that. And I would try explaining to these folks that it's not really a versus situation here. I mean, foundationally, both of these are open source technologies. Cloud Foundry was an abstraction over an orchestrator. Kubernetes was an orchestrator looking for a good platform abstraction over and above it. And so the two technologies were actually, very complementary to each other since the outset. And because it's an open source world, and I'll probably emphasize this a few more times in the conversation, the two technologies were not quite a match made in heaven, but quite a good match. And we're seeing more of that emerge in terms of, there's, for example, tag app delivery within the CNCF community, with platform working groups and artifact working groups, and solving the exact problem that Cloud Foundry is set out to solve and serve. And so in this sort of underserved area of the Kubernetes ecosystem vis-a-vis platforms, I think Cloud Foundry has a definite space for itself. And we're looking at projects from within the community that sort of address this. There's a whole bunch of other projects, like Julian mentioned, that address some of these other niche areas. And so broadly speaking, platforms, and then in a niche way solve the services problem in Kubernetes, solve some of the auth and RBAC and unified authentication problems in Kubernetes, and try to solve multi-tenancy, which is like a big thorn for the Kubernetes community. And because Cloud Foundry has well over a decade of having solved these problems at scale, it's probably a good idea to try and implement those patterns and paradigms that have been a part of the Cloud Foundry toolchain, and see if it works for the Kubernetes community. Maybe it will, maybe it won't, but we won't know until we've tried.
And there's one thing to say about this, because I agree with all of it. But I think a lot of times, if you think Cloud Foundry and compare it somehow and try to relate it to Kubernetes, discussions actually fall short of one thing. They tend to look at the user experience so much that they forget about the operations of such a platform. So a lot of developers, for example, they don't have to think about how to run these things and what are the costs involved of running these infrastructures. So they compare the developer experience from one technology with another. But this is only half the equation. So if, for example, we discuss with our clients, we have environments where there are, let's say, 3, 4, 5,000 virtual machines running in one environment, where there are a couple of thousand virtual machines, dedicated service instances with different databases, but there are also a lot of virtual machines running applications in containers. So if you're looking at 4,000 or 5,000 virtual machine-sized environments, the question is, if you take that and you take the CNCF open source, landscape, and you build a platform that comes as close as possible to the developer experience, you'd still face a very different operational challenge. And that's one of the things that I think we really need to understand about Cloud Foundry, is that it's not Cloud Foundry alone. The most underrated automation technology of the last decade is BOSH. It's BOSH. Because BOSH is the infrastructure abstraction. BOSH is the operating system abstraction. BOSH is the reason why Cloud Foundry can do what it does at that scale it does it at. And if you take away BOSH from the equation, you'd see that the operational efficiency of Cloud Foundry is in doubt. It's not enough to take Cloud Foundry and, because, since I've been in Cloud Foundry, which is more than a decade now, I've seen the cloud orchestrator within Cloud Foundry be replaced at least 2 or 3 times. So, Cloud Foundry is not its container orchestration. You could just swap it out and, have Kubernetes in there. But that doesn't solve the problem on how to operate Cloud Foundry at scale. You need to take the whole equation into mind, because only if you do that, customers will really migrate. You have to have a path to another system that has the same operational efficiency and a migration path is viable for production workloads with little timeouts. And this is just not happening. So even if you have, in theory, a developer parity with some other technology, you'd still have to have the operational at scale, the same parity with the operational efficiency. And then you have to have a migration path, for example. So I would even go so far and say that in 2024, with an investment into a good sales force, you can start selling Cloud Foundries, because the Cloud Foundry business case is absolutely viable in 2024 as it was in 2014.
No, very well said. Ram, Any commentary there?
It's heartening to always see, support for growing the community around an open source technology, and with a broad enough experience in technology, there are certain teams that can execute that. There are certain teams that seem to build off of that and build successful businesses, and we totally welcome that and will wholeheartedly support that in any form or manner possible.
What kind of projects, of course, Julian, you mentioned Clutch, but there are so many other projects which are also from the Cloud Foundry community. You folks have also been working on a lot of projects to bridge the gap or build a bridge between Cloud Foundry and Kubernetes world. Can you folks talk about some of those projects which are kind of now mature or even you're seeing in production in some cases?
So there's a few projects of the nature that are typically applicable to the cloud native community, but are part of the Cloud Foundry ecosystem, so to say. And the biggest one by far is the work that the community has done around cloud native build packs. So there's a Paketo build packs project that is owned by the foundation, which is largely an implementation of cloud native build packs that have been driven by the same members as the Cloud Foundry Foundation. So big contributions from VMware and SAP, so to say, and also other members who've participated in this. And we're at a point in the evolution of cloud native build packs where we are considering porting them as the default build packs for any Cloud Foundry based build. So there's some RFCs, there's some stuff that's experimental out there that's trying to adopt cloud native build packs within the Cloud Foundry ecosystem. But just by itself, Paketo build packs is a production ready, rather stable and mature open source project that can be used by the cloud native ecosystem. There's a few other smaller projects. So for example, there's cloud service brokers. Not a lot of traction for it, but then again, solving the services use case for the cloud native ecosystem. There's these projects by folks like anynines that we are eager to see in the space as well. I'll let Julian wax a little more eloquently about that.
Well, I personally find all the activities in the Cloud Foundry Foundation very appealing and interesting. I find that, well, we shouldn't forget about projects such as Corefi, where Cloud Foundry can be run on Kubernetes, and where there's the vision of carrying on the heritage of Cloud Foundry and bring it more cloud natively on Kubernetes. I think overall, build packs, as you mentioned, is one of the big selling points in writing software at the enterprise. I think the entire creation process of container images has been so widely associated with Docker files, for example, that some people forget, if you run a large organization and let's say you wrap up a lot of Java apps and you want to make them executable, how can you make sure that every developer checks the right check marks and checks the right boxes? And I think build packs provide an excellent methodology for a larger organization to enforce policies and standards in how to create container images. There are alternatives in building container images using Docker with security scanning and all that built into the pipeline. But I think for developers who just want to write code and to do the standard web development kind of stuff, build packs are just fascinating. So I just recently had, in my spare time, a Ruby on Rails app. I drafted a simple app. I wanted to have a RabbitMQ and a Postgres and deploying it online. And I created a Kubernetes cluster because I wanted to just, judge about the user experience. And I'm a big fan of Kubernetes. I'm not trying to be biased towards Cloud Foundry here, but seriously, this was my own time, and I actually wanted to learn more about Kubernetes in production and so on. but I also wanted to get the application running. I ended up at our own Cloud Foundry platform, just see if push the whole thing, create service. I had my Postgres database here, and not to fiddle around with downloading my own operators. Maybe I'm a bit impatient, but I was surprised to see, that it's just so nice to just see if push, see the build packs in action, and not have to worry about, in the end, I just wanted to write that app and not spend my time in fiddling around with Kubernetes. Now, there are scenarios where I wouldn't be able to use Cloud Foundry. So, for example, I had a friend, and they use they do time-lapse cameras, and they have an incoming stream of photos, and they need to process them, in a certain way. So this system we wrapped up in Kubernetes because it just didn't fit Cloud Foundry well enough. So I really believe that in organization, now I'm always talking about problems at scale, you need to have a certain understanding what the typical workload is. And if you find yourself in a way that you're writing a lot of standard web apps that will be 12-factor compliant, and you have hundreds or thousands of them, oh boy, look at that Cloud Foundry.
If you look ahead, where do you see Kubernetes is heading? Where do you see Cloud Foundry is heading? Because new workloads are emerging, new trends are emerging, new technologies are emerging. The shiny technology is, of course, Gen AI. People talk a lot about these days, which also means new challenges, new opportunities. So where do you see Kubernetes and Cloud Foundry are heading?
Kubernetes is much more than container orchestration these days. And I think that's one of the things what makes Kubernetes so special. It's, first of all, it's a large and fast-growing ecosystem. So it's a community, and it's a lot of people, and it's getting more every day. So that's just unprecedented. I'm absolutely amazed by that, what they've accomplished. Second, the container orchestrator is pretty solid. And for what it does, let's say you have a workload that matches the Kubernetes model, doesn't get too, multi-tenancy, whatever. So if it fits the Kubernetes model, Kubernetes is just a wonderful way of declaratively automating, both web apps and stateful workloads. So its flexibility, absolutely awesome. And then the third aspect is building cloud APIs. If you're building a cloud API these days, how can you get around Kubernetes? I think you can't. It's the de facto standard of writing cloud automation software these days. So in this regard, I think the direction of Kubernetes is omnipresence in cloud automation. And it provides you with that ability to, put that abstraction layer on top of infrastructures, a bit what OpenStack promised, but never really kept. So I think the Kubernetes ecosystem, cannibalized from so many different movements, including the Docker movement and the OpenStack movement as well. So I think Kubernetes is the place where everything converges somehow. So where is it headed? I'd say we'll be surprised on how creative people will be to, force fit any AI tooling into Kubernetes, for example.
We're looking at an era of newer workloads on these kinds of infrastructure, and where I think both Kubernetes and Cloud Foundry shine as a community is they've been very open and receptive to a lot of the changes that have come along. Just looking at Cloud Foundry, they precede the Docker days of containerization, they precede the Kubernetes days of orchestration, and now as Gen AI becomes a thing, we're seeing some experimental projects in the community where Cloud Foundry is expanding to manage GPU compute just the way they do VMs and things like that. And so I think if the community can come together and provide a useful way to manage GPU compute as efficiently as it helped manage CPU compute, I think the technology, has a sort of bright future in the AI era. Likewise, I think Kubernetes will become very functional in terms of accepting AI as a workload and sort of providing that, at the moment, non-standard footprint for AI applications that, Kubernetes and AI feel like right shoe, wrong fit at times. But, like Julian said, the community will surprise you by coming up with ways in which you can retrofit AI applications on Kubernetes and things like that. And so I think, from accepting applications and workloads to helping make compute more efficient, I think the two technologies can work very well in this future that we see of AI based applications. And, you know, it'll continue, I guess, to do all this while keeping the core of getting 12 factor apps out there and making sure services work, and better load balancing and managing ingress, which seems to be the toughest problem on Kubernetes of the day. So I think the two technologies have a lot cut out in terms of where they need to be, and the two communities are hard at work in helping realize that future. And all I can say is we are in for an amazing ride watching these communities and technologies grow.
As these new workloads are emerging, new use cases are emerging, do you also see that, hey, this is what Cloud Foundry was, kind of designed to do? So where you suddenly see that there might be a lot of interest again in Cloud Foundry because it is solving some of those problems in a way that's meant to be solved.
I truly believe that if you're writing, a lot of applications, they're cloud native, they're 12-factor compliant, you like the concept of a build pack, you want to have multi-tenancy, and you're running an organization with hundreds or thousands of developers, why would you go start building your own platform with Kubernetes? Look at the Kubernetes CNCF ecosystem. It's a pleasure. Like, I love it. But it's so many little building blocks. If you want to build your platform, don't underestimate the complexity of it. So if Cloud Foundry does the trick, take Cloud Foundry. This is not a popularity contest. This is about finding the right tool for the right job. I believe that in 2024, CIO and CTOs should consider Cloud Foundry as a technology. We are over the days where we thought that Cloud Foundry will go away. It won't go away. It will be here for years to come. So why not just adopt a technology that provides the better operational efficiency and solves problems that Kubernetes doesn't? And it won't for the next years to come. Just don't be so emotional about it. I think that's the pitch I'll do for my own customers as well. So I just look at the two technologies, compare them in a fair way, and just forget for a moment about the hype and all that. It's just look at what's the right tool for the job. And I'd say more folks should be reconsidering Cloud Foundry.
There's definitely some areas where Cloud Foundry does shine bright. And, if the Kubernetes community can take that into consideration and start, pursuing Cloud Foundry as a viable option to operate alongside Kubernetes, I think that'd be great. Fingers crossed, we see a Cloud Foundry / cloud native renaissance soon. If the technology does pick up and work well, it would make me very happy.
When we talk about Kubernetes or this whole CNCF cloud native landscape, as Julian rightly said, it's a beautiful landscape. It's a big one, but beautiful. You need 4K, if not 4K, 12K or even 16K screen to see all the logos on there, which also means we talk a lot about cost and complexity. What does cost and complexity mean when folks work with Cloud Foundry? Does that address the problem, or the problem when it comes to cost and complexity are same?
My experience is the following. If you have 4 good trained people, you can run a Cloud Foundry, you can run half dozen Cloud Foundry environments managing thousands, if not 10,000s of apps. With our data service automation, it's a proprietary and commercial product, but you take the Cloud Foundry stack, Cloud Foundry plus a proper data service automation, you have a fully featured turnkey solution for your apps. And if you look at, the scale of having 10,000 apps running there, and you then look at shell shock, for example, where both your data service instances and your container host might be affected, and you need to turn over, let's say, 5,000 or 6,000 VMs in an instant. We do that we have an operations team that are 10 people, and they run 40,000 virtual machines, right? Well, look, where else can you find that operational efficiency? Answer that question, and I mean, you get the answer to your question. It's unprecedented. And I still believe that for that very reason, the entire Cloud Foundry stack is absolutely underrated.
Yeah, I've heard this theme play out a lot in different conversations we've had. The kind of scale that Cloud Foundry can operate at is phenomenal. And, like I said, the more people are become cognizant of that and are willing to take a look at Cloud Foundry as a technology, I think there's a lot to be gained in terms of efficiency. And the mention of cost and complexity bring to mind one of these past keynotes that I think happened in Amsterdam, where one of the co-chairs was giving a Yelp review for different aspects of Kubernetes, and she said, uh, it's great in terms of the feature set it has. It's amazing in terms of reliability and things like that, blah blah blah. And then she came down to simplicity and gave it a 1 star. And I think people are starting to recognize how complex a beast Kubernetes can be for a very valid reason. It solves a complex problem, and therefore, by nature, the solution is complex. But at the same time, there's more organizations that are realizing how complex it can be, and with it the overall cost of ownership. And people are starting to realize, well, this is not as simple or economical as we imagined it to be. It does solve a very interesting problem, and I think this past decade of Cloud Foundry of Kubernetes has really reached a point where people are open to the possibility of having an opinionated path that can navigate through 1,700 different projects that make up the CNCF landscape. And that gives scope to a large number of these platform tools, one of which is, Cloud Foundry, to emerge within the Kubernetes ecosystem, make use of CNCF projects, and provide a golden path while allowing you to be, you know, while allowing you to choose which projects you want and you don't, and further customize the tool as well. So we're seeing a few players emerge in the space, obviously, and it's very heartening to see that the road is paved with good intentions. Let's see what lies at the end of the road.
One funny metaphor comes to my mind when I think about Cloud Foundry and Kubernetes is sometimes, I picture that YouTube video where you'd say Cloud Foundry versus Kubernetes, but you'd actually think of Cloud Foundry as, a multi-story, multi-tenant building to live in. And Kubernetes would be, let's say, the framework for building your own house, right? And you could both use to build a house where you could live in, so that's comparable. But then you're totally lost in that comparison because you're not really considering buying a skyscraper if you're alone or have 4 kids, right? But if you're need to house a village, well, a skyscraper is more appropriate. And to me, Cloud Foundry and Kubernetes is exactly that. Kubernetes and Cloud Foundry are so different that I'm just asking myself, why do we keep comparing it so much? It just makes so much sense. There's an overlap, yeah, container orchestration, but that is such a broad term. Just it doesn't make really sense to compare it in the first place. And that's the whole thing is, why don't we just focus on people and telling people and educating people is when do you need to consider Cloud Foundry and when do you need to consider Kubernetes? There's no way around Kubernetes if you're a large organization, but there's also a good reason to have a Cloud Foundry if you're a large organization, and there's no conflict of interest here. It's actually they can coexist quite well, and it's to some degree it's meaningless to compare them.
It becomes tempting to compare. So as we do that, so yeah, you'll see a lot of internet lines. I want to go to another point, which is if you look at new emerging businesses, like EVs can be good examples. Mostly they lean a Linux platform, because with Linux and other open source technologies, you don't have to go where the technology is. Technology will come where you are. So once again, I'm Julian. I'm sorry that I am going to put it in the comparison bracket there, but if you look at Kubernetes and Cloud Foundry, which one is the one that lowers the barrier of entry? Where, as you said, you can get started quickly. You don't have to have a lot of, head start there. Once again, it's not like I'm not comparing, but just, which makes it easier for businesses to get started.
If you think about running a Cloud Foundry, on VMs using BOSH, that's quite a commitment to get it started. And I think that's also one of the reasons why Cloud Foundry over the years lost in popularity, is because Bosch was never really promoted in and getting popularity, which I don't really understand. And the second thing is, in the very early days, there was micro Bosch, and there was a kind of effort on getting a Cloud Foundry up and running on your laptop. And at some point, they just let it go. And I think where there was so much work in progress for the organization and the people working on Cloud Foundry, that I get that they had to let go of some things. Well, in hindsight, it's always easier to make, well, that would have been the solution. There is some part of me believes that if we did not let go that possibility to run a small and more lightweight version on a laptop of Cloud Foundry, maybe that would have helped. But I mean, who knows? So in the sense that you can download Minikube or Kind on your laptop and get a Kubernetes cluster up and running, and also you can then also install a Cloud Foundry on top of it on your laptop these days. I'd say Kubernetes has a head start here because it's just the foundation, just that thing that you download and install, and you can do, any funny stuff with it. And that's also one of the reasons why it was able, to cannibalize from the Docker movement. Because if you think about how Docker got popular, it's something that a developer, and I've been saying that for years, it's something that a developer, after 8 years at 8 hours at the office, could download at home, have this rewarding experience, and also mitigate some of the problems on how to develop and stuff on my own laptop. So if you take that, and then you'd be able to download Kubernetes, and all right, you have that same experience. That's something that Cloud Foundry never really allowed you to do. And I would point out a contradiction that already Heroku has, the inspiration of Cloud Foundry, so to say. And the 12-factor manifest says dev prod parity. So your development environment should be as close as your production environment as it should be, meaning that there's a staging Cloud Foundry and there's a production Cloud Foundry. You just retarget and there you go. But is that the reality? I'm not developing my app in Cloud Foundry. I'm developing my app on my computer. And this is where Cloud Foundry lets you go. And this is where Docker and Kubernetes make a better job. However, the build pack experience versus the Docker experience, there's also a pro and con argument for this. And if you then apply it at scale, you have so many developers and you have a Cloud Foundry user experience is fine. But when it comes to just download it and experiences, I think Cloud Foundry is not exactly that what Kubernetes has. Kubernetes is more approachable. It's something that you can just download and throw it at your laptop and there you go. And that's, to some degree, a source of momentum for it.
There's actually a few more things I'd like to add to what Julian had said. I completely agree, and plus one on that sentiment of what Cloud Foundry can and cannot do for local development and things like that. And historically, Cloud Foundry has also been a slightly less open source ecosystem, in my opinion. If you look at the dojo model and the way they allowed you to contribute to their open source code base and things like that, was not espousing the open source spirit 100%. And although it was a fully open project, your entire Cloud Foundry installation was different Cloud Foundry org projects. It was not necessarily possible to swap components in and out. And so these were the three big sort of complaints that the community had around Cloud Foundry, and it's something that we've been resolving very actively in the past few years. So if you look at Corefi right now, like Julian mentioned, you can get a Corefi instance running on your laptop with very few resources, and it was never possible to run a Bosch Lite. Even though it was a Bosch Lite, it was not possible. And so allowing developers to get that full experience and allowing people to make top-down suit-driven decisions to adopt Cloud Foundry has traditionally been a bit of a hard and a difficult process. But we're, as a community, we're getting better at it, both from the technical and the non-technical angles. And I think we owe it a lot to our member companies to continue to chip away at that problem and make it possible for more Cloud Foundry adoption among their customers and users, and build the community that way.
I can absolutely agree to this. And the Cloud Foundry Foundation has made a tremendous progress in making, new community members feel welcome at any company size. So when at the peak of Cloud Foundry popularity, before Kubernetes became so popular, Cloud Foundry was a big boys game. It was a lot of large organizations in the foundation, and more policy was introduced, making the barrier of entry higher and higher. So at some point, I have to, maybe this is just my own personal feelings and perception of it, but I felt a little left behind in the days. As an owner of a small organization, our voice would really matter. And as the community grow bigger, I felt like left behind in the sense that, now you're not needed anymore. Now we got the big players, and this is not what it is today. Today, if you show up at the Cloud Foundry community and you want to contribute, there are people coming to you with open arms and helping you to get started. And this is something that I think will also add to more popularity in the futures, because especially mid-sized companies, they have great benefits from the Cloud Foundry ecosystem, and they will be very welcome, is my perception of what the Cloud Foundry Foundation is today.
Can you also talk about the ecosystem, because the folks who are still on Cloud Foundry, and as we talk about some of the emerging cases where Cloud Foundry make more sense, what kind of vendor ecosystem is there for the folks who do want to continue or who want to embrace Cloud Foundry? They do know there is a throat to choke, there is a company they can go to.
So the Cloud Foundry ecosystem is fortunate to have members who are players of different shapes and sizes, as I like to call them. A lot of this is more of a perception problem as opposed to a technological problem, because irrespective of what size our members are, I've seen that they're all phenomenal engineers. You have amazing talent that's distributed across big companies and small companies and medium companies and regional companies and global players and all of these things. And so our big sort of tiers are Broadcom, which was VMware, today Broadcom, and SAP. So if you wish to play with one of these big known global sort of names, and that's what will pass through your procurement pipelines, then we have that kind of those kind of organizations. In the sort of mid serviceable levels, Anynines is an amazing player. They have a global footprint. They have an amazing footprint in Europe. They always help bring a lot of the people together in the European community. So there's Anynines is a great example. And then for people who are much smaller, nimbler, looking for the odd contractual work that helps them work with Cloud Foundry and things like that, we have a couple of players in that size and space as well. And so it's very heartening to see that the community can help service all these different kinds of requests as it stands today.
Well, I think that there's actually room for organizations to position in that ecosystem as of today. Because in the times when the popularity of Cloud Foundry declined, a lot of companies who were consultancies left the community by either selling or by just going out of service. And I think that was partly because there was a certain shortage in the demand for consulting. However, now it would be nice to have them back because there's still the demand. So I would say there is room to position companies in the Cloud Foundry ecosystem. So we had this conversation where a lot of those companies, they were friends of mine, and I always said, look, if you wanna survive as an organization throughout the life cycle of a product category, like platform as a service or technologies are as well, then you'd have to have a source for predictable repeating revenue, and consulting is exactly the opposite of that. You'll be the first invoices or the first spendings to cut when costs need to be cut. And I understand that product companies want you to be there and that you find that is a niche, but we found ourselves in a position where we had to move to make our own products because it was becoming more obvious that a product company wants to outsource the professional services to be evaluated as a product company. And that makes the smaller partners in that ecosystem unstable if they don't have their own business model that provides them with recurring revenue. So I would say there are niches to be conquered in the Cloud Foundry ecosystem. There are ways to position yourselves with a stable and healthy income, and people should go for it. Other than that, the large vendors are there. They have huge workloads. They have a selling machinery. New companies will adopt the technology. I think it's healthy. So I would say overall, the Cloud Foundry community is an excellent place to be. And there are still niches to be captured.
One more thing that I want to talk to you about is, this is one of the hottest either technologies or topics these days, which is Gen AI LLMs. Can you talk about from Cloud Foundry's perspective? I'm not looking at Kubernetes perspective. How do you folks look at it? Gen AI for Cloud Foundry or Cloud Foundry for Gen AI?
I don't have really much to say about Gen AI, to be honest. In my personal opinion, it's a tool that developers should have in their tool belt. It reminds me a bit of making homework in the bus, where you basically look at the homework somebody else did and just change it so much that it will pass the test. And the lack of the actual creativity in that process is a bit disturbing to me. So I believe Gen AI is heavily overrated, although it is absolutely surprising how amazing the outcomes are. So I'm fascinated, but I think it's overfed, right? You go to any conference and every keynote is about AI, and it's like I feel like a duck being force-fed with grain, right? It's like, stop it already. So there will be wonderful applications, but I don't have so much to say about it.
Yeah, every conference except a Cloud Foundry conference, I guess. But at the same time, I think the community does recognize that there's a lot of people that require Gen AI to be supported and want to showcase platforms being a viable receptacle for AI workloads. And Cloud Foundry has a few examples of that, both on and off Kubernetes. And there's also the part about making GPUs work efficiently for Gen AI based applications through Cloud Foundry. And the reason I believe this is a very critical thing for the community is Gen AI, while fascinating and mesmerizing and all of these things, can be very expensive. And so it costs quite the dollar for companies in order to go through one round of inference or what have you. And for companies that were worried, that have always been historically worried as an industry about cloud costs, Gen AI costs are going to come as a big thing to talk about. And I think if you're able to optimize that slightly more, both in terms of how the application is built and run and how the infrastructure and compute below is used, I think the community can find a small victory there that it can boast about. And that's where I see the future of the two technologies intersect and the two communities sort of make best of working together.
I absolutely agree with you. So if you think about Gen AI from two different perspectives, you could say, well, from one perspective, the application developer's perspective, it's a backing service. Could be exposed through an open source broker API, injecting credentials to an API, which will then can be consumed just like any other API. So API integration only, you don't care where this thing operates. It could be a beast sitting in some other, I don't know, data center or whatnot. So that integration aspect is one of the challenges that need to be faced, and I think there will be integrations for all the major, use cases pretty soon. And the second is that the AI tooling also is a complicated distributed workload, and then you have to understand the difference between applying a model and training a model. So I'd say the applying a model is basically like some sort of stateful workload distributed system. So in that regard, it has a certain similarity compared to databases. So we, for example, at anynines, we think about entering the space of operating data service like fully automated AI tooling as well, and add that to our offering. However, if you think about training AI models, where you really need to spend a lot of money into gathering data, storing data, and processing data, then you also find, as Ram pointed out, there's a certain hardware affinity. So in order to get those things right, you also, on the software layer, need to make assumptions about the hardware and solve all these puzzles. I'd say Cloud Foundry and Kubernetes will have a say in how these workloads can be mitigated and operated in an effective manner.
Julian, Ram, thank you so much for joining me today, and a great discussion on Kubernetes and Cloud Foundry. I also, Julian, fully agree with you. It's not a competitor. We cover a lot of technologies that complement each other. So thanks for great insights, and I look forward to talking to you folks again soon. Thank you.
Thank you for having me again. Also a great pleasure to meet you again, Ram. Hopefully see all of you in person at the next Cloud Foundry conference.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, Swapnil. It was a pleasure chatting with you as always, and thank you both for being such important stewards of the community.